Hi, it's Jonathan Singer, and I'm sorry I can't be with you guys tonight for Marta's class, but I am very excited to talk to you briefly about applying for a job and attending conferences. So, um, the first thing I want to say about applying for a job is that the process of writing your letter of interest and of selecting schools and all that sort of stuff is in and of itself educational. Back in 2007, when I went on the job market for the 2008-2009 academic year, I actually learned a lot about myself writing the letter. Like, how do I take what I know and what I can do and put it into some words? Well, that process helped me to market myself, because when I went on the job interview, I had already figured out the frame. I'd figured out the context. I'd figured out some of the things I wanted to highlight and some of the things that I didn't need to talk about. Um, Now, it took me about 100 hours to write my letter, in part because I sent it out to people and I said, what do you think? I got some feedback. But it's a hard thing to write. There's a lot of information. Now, I know some people write the letter so that it's one letter for all schools. I personalized mine because I was picking different schools for different reasons. Um, I picked Smith because of its focus on clinical education. I picked Temple because of its balance between research and teaching. And so each of my letters was different. And that was okay, because when I went to talk to folks, I had different ideas. So I know that you're not quite at the stage where you're applying for schools, but I just wanted to say that this is something to think about, and it's never too early to write down how you would present yourself to folks for the job market. Now, one of the things about job hunting is that you can start at any point in your doctoral program. And what you do is you start thinking about, well, what school do I want to go to? There are a lot of schools out there. There's some research intensive. There's some places that primarily focus on teaching. There's the balance. Loyola is a good example of a place that balances both. And you get to talk to folks and learn about these schools, mostly at conferences, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. But take the time to ask questions. What's it like to work there, right? You might think, oh, Boston College, I'd love to be in Boston and teach at Boston College. And then you start talking to folks, you're like, wow, okay, this is a different environment than I was imagining. Either it might be more competitive, or it might be a little more rigid, or whatever. Or it might be exactly what you're looking for. And this can take a couple of years to figure out. So start your job hunt now. Not that you're necessarily going to find your exact school, because it could be that the year that you go on the market, that school isn't hiring, but at least you're finding the schools that you think you might want to work at. Now, the conferences are a great place to get information. You can also cold call junior faculty, right? Go on the website, find out who's an assistant professor, somebody who was hired there last year or the year before, and call them up and say, hey, I'm not on the job market, but I'm just curious what your experience has been like working at this school. When I was applying in 2007, 2008, I did that, and I got great feedback from folks. Now, of course, the job market is like dating, right? Is that people put their best face forward, and what people tell you about the job isn't necessarily exactly what it is that you're going to be doing, but oftentimes it's close. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about my experience when I was on the job market and I decided on Temple University. Kind of is the idea that your first job doesn't have to be your last. So I applied to Temple. I heard that they had some research on youth suicide, and they had a grant through SAMHSA. And I knew about the grant mechanism, and I heard about the research, and they said they needed somebody on faculty to kind of take it over and to reapply and to write some pubs based on the data. And I thought, this is amazing. And I got there, and it turned out that the research, the data collection, was a disaster. And so there were no publications that could come out of it. And furthermore, SAMHSA was not particularly happy with Temple University's School of Social Work based on what had happened with the research. And so that funding mechanism was essentially gone. couldn't do anything with it. Well, there I was at the school that I thought I was going to be doing one thing, and I kind of had thought about my tenure packet that way, and then it turned out it was something else. But I persevered. And part of the reason why I persevered is because I loved my students. I thought they were great students. And I had some colleagues that I really liked. And like yourself, I was used to kind of making the most out of a situation, right? Of succeeding. That's how we all get to where we are. Is we're good at succeeding. And I had people saying, I don't know if this is the best fit for you. I'm like, no, I can do this, right? I can do this. And there were a couple of things that let me know that it wasn't a good fit. Some of those were in my control. Some of those were out of my control. One of those things was that I was in a meeting in my first year, and I said something about, what sort of things, we've talked a lot about things that can support people to be excellent researchers. What sort of supports are there for folks who are interested in being excellent teachers? Dead silence. Like the tension, you could cut it with a knife. And somebody said, well, if you're interested in being an excellent teacher, then this is not the place for you. And I thought, well, that's pretty jaded. But I later understood what that meant, which was that attending things at the Teaching and Learning Center, or being interested in the scholarship of teaching and learning, and really taking a vested interest in your students. These are all things that take time, and they take time away from writing grants and writing publications. It's not that you can't do both, but that you have to make sure you're excellent in your research in order to justify being excellent in your teaching. And the first 7 years in your job is this sort of tenure track time. And at first I thought, well, this is kind of an arbitrary length of time, and in some ways it is. But the best way to think about the assistant professor time is that you're being given a lump of time to become an expert in something. Getting your PhD means that you have demonstrated that you have the skills to embark on becoming an expert. And then you're given 7 years to develop expertise. Well, if I was focusing on teaching and a bunch of service, and I was focusing on my research, I would be split in multiple directions. And at least at Temple, the focus was demonstrating excellence in research. And so doing these other things took time away from the research. I was also told that the podcast was a waste of time, that I shouldn't do it, and I shouldn't even include it on my CV. Eventually, it became very clear, because of change in leadership, that being at Temple the folks at Temple were not going to be supportive of the things that I thought were important and that I know are important. And so I ended up looking for another job. Now, I looked for jobs as an associate level professor. Because I had been there for 7 years. I'd sort of done my assistant professor gig, and I was interested in seeing if I could get an associate level professor position. And all the places that I applied were like, yes, you've great publications and conferences and service and your research and all those sorts of things. So that worked out, which was very validating. Again, sort of getting a different perspective was helpful in knowing that other people thought that what I thought was important was also important. Now, let me switch to conference tips, because this sort of plays into how I got to Loyola. The first thing I'll say about conferences is that conferences are so important in professional development in academia. One of the most important things that you can do at conferences is network. Now, networking is just a fancy word for meeting people that you like and that you want to hang out with, and who, in some sense can be of service and value to you in your career. Now, it's not always clear how they're going to be valuable, but that's why liking them is important. There's no use in having a professional network of people that you don't like and who don't like you. It doesn't matter that I could count in my network the most important and powerful social work dean in the entire profession. But if we don't like each other, then this person's never going to call on me, and I'm not going to be particularly excited to be around this person. Meanwhile, there could be another doctoral student that I just think is the bomb, that I love having in my network, and that I'm fostering this relationship. And so that's valuable. Um, Now, a lot of times people think that networking is hard at conferences, and it certainly can be, because conferences can be really overwhelming. But here are a couple of tips. First, I think the buddy system is excellent. Have another doctoral student that you like to hang out with, and say, let's hang out. Let's hang out at the parties. Let's hang out at the lobby bar, which is a great place to hang out. Let's go to some sessions together. If you know a professor, ask that professor to introduce you to other folks. Those introductions are super important, because obviously there's transfer of social capital that happens that way. Special interest groups are also another way that you can meet folks at varying levels in their career trajectory around a shared interest. So, for example, a few years ago, I was at an arts-based special interest group, and I met Brian Kelly, and he was a doctoral student, and he talked about his dissertation, which I thought was fascinating. Fast forward maybe a year or so, and he was done, or maybe 2 years, and I thought, I want to get this guy on the podcast. So I asked him, and we arranged to do an interview at one of the conferences for the podcast. And then a couple years later, he said, hey, Jonathan, I heard that you were on the job market. I want to let you know that there's some folks from Loyola who are here doing interviews at the hotel. And I thought, oh, I've never really thought about going to Loyola, in part because we were kind of East Coast. But I went and I had a fabulous conversation with these folks who were interviewing for Loyola. And here I am. So meeting Brian at this arts-based SIG resulted in me getting an associate professor level job at Loyola. So you never know, right? And I think Brian's awesome. So there's that. Now, so you can network by hanging out with people, having professors introduce you, going to these special interest groups or focus groups. I would also say that it's important to make a plan when you're at the conference. So, for example, all the conference brochures are online. And so you want to read that first. You want to search by things that you're interested in so that you can do that. And you might want to think about this little format. Like, so you want to attend session A, meet Professor B, go to reception C, and get the answer to question D. And that might look like, let's say you're interested in qualitative research. You might find a methodological session, right? A session on methodology, qualitative methodology. You might meet Professor Jim Driscoll from Smith, or Deb Paget from New York, author of the famous qualitative methods text. You might then go to a reception that is being hosted by a school that you think you might want to work at. And you get to meet the dean, and you get to meet other faculty. And then finally, while you're there, if you've got a question like, is it ever okay to propose a comparative qualitative study, you can just ask a bunch of people. So you have a plan. And what this does is it kind of keeps conferences from being totally overwhelming to being very productive for you. Now, I always suggest when you're at these conferences, build in some downtime, and that could mean going and seeing the sites. Now, I wouldn't suggest seeing a lot of sites, because you're paying a lot of money, and these are actually really valuable networking opportunities. But, you know, if you're in New Orleans, for example, in January, you totally should get beignets and drink chicory coffee. And even better, go with a professor and somebody that you want to talk to as you're walking down the street and you're seeing things, because it just makes for a totally different quality of conversation. Now, speaking of that, it's always good to have an elevator pitch. And this just isn't for your research. This could be an elevator pitch about who you are and what you want to do. And spend some time working this out. Practice it with your colleagues. So for your research, of course, you want to have your elevator pitch, and that's just like a 30, 60, or 90-second summary of what your research is. You want to do that for your poster presentations, but also if you're doing a paper, you also want to be able to do that too, so that if you're bumping into somebody and you're like, oh yeah, hey, so I'm giving this presentation Sunday morning at 7:30, and then you give them a great 90-second pitch, they might be willing to get up. Otherwise, it's going to be you and the other two people who are scheduled for that session, right? Which is another thing. Like, don't get too freaked out if there's nobody at your session. It just happens. Anyway, so the elevator pitch. hanging out and seeing the sights. And then kind of the last thing, and this is just kind of an overarching thing, not a specific thing, but you know, when you're at these conferences, you want to be professional and inclusive, right? If you're there as a doctoral student and you're volunteering and you're wearing the t-shirts and you're standing there and you're saying, oh, can I help you find a room? You know, you want to be professional. You don't want to be sitting there on your phone. You don't want to be rude to people because you don't know who you're meeting. Even the other students, right? The grad student who this year is wearing the t-shirt with you will next year be on a search committee. Now they might be on the search committee as a doctoral student, or they might have gotten a job and they're there as a first year assistant professor. And then after a few years, that person's going to end up chairing the search committee or being the chair of the department. And all the folks that you are in school with now are going to be the leaders in the social work field in academia in 5, 10, 20 years. And so being generous, being inclusive, being a nice person, this really goes a long way in life, but especially at these professional conferences. Anyway, I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys might have about what I've said. Feel free to email me, and I hope that you have a great rest of your time.